So I think that what we're witnessing is the complete destruction of the US. And if you were to ask me, what do I think that Trump job actually is? I would say that his mission is not the reform of the US and most certainly not the return of the US to previous times, however unsavory you might find those times. The job of Trump is essentially the dismantling of the American project, full stop. And I think that what happened on Saturday when Trump and his administration completely disregarded judicial orders issued by a judge to stop deportation flights of people whose identity remains completely unknown, who were rounded up across the US, put on a plane, and sent to El Salvador, essentially to outsource what really looks like the slave use. Actually, El Salvador has said that they will be subjected to hard labor in the camps in which they were turned to. What we actually have in that, and in several of the judicial sort of acts of subversions by the Trump administration, including the deportation of a physician that had come back from Lebanon who works at Brown University, and so on and so forth, is essentially the process of dismantling American institutions. And I think that when you look over the 2-month period in which Trump has been in power, what we see is a consistent pattern of institutional dismantling and um, geostrategic, essentially, um, retreat, which to a very large degree corresponds to what one would imagine the Chinese and the Russians would be most interested in seeing in places like Africa, Latin America, and Asia. But let's get to that in a second. I mean, what we have had since the beginning of the Trump administration, and particularly at the hand of Musk, who in my mind is not in the spectrum, as they said, but is probably just a drug addict who has basically been giving an insane amount of power in what in other countries would be called a super ministry, in order to put his fingers into the budgetary and therefore the operational affairs of all secretariats and all structures within the American government. What we have seen is basically the complete destruction of all parts of the American government and all forms of American programs. So we have seen, of course, the now well discussed and well covered destruction of USAID, which has, in places like Africa and South America, completely ceded the territory to Russian and Chinese interests. We have seen the almost complete devastation of essentially healthcare at different stages. We have seen the complete destruction of agricultural programs. We have seen as well the sort of really rather stunning reduction of smaller programs. Now, for instance, the peace program of the US, and over the last 2 or 3 days, the disassembly of the program for tracking Russian crimes in Ukraine, including the forcible transfer of about 20,000 children to Russian territory, a war crime, by the way. We have also seen the complete sort of disarticulation of regulatory entities and regulatory figures, which are generally independent of political pressure. Those are inspector generals. This happened actually the first week after Trump came into power. And interestingly enough, some of these inspectors were the ones that were charged with looking at what Musk was actually doing in sort of terms of Tesla and in terms of X Space, or whatever the hell his model airplane industrial project is. What is really interesting about all of this is that it basically shows not so much a pattern of reform, as they would like to put it, but it's much more consistent with the kind of destruction that Javier Milei is causing in Argentina, which is presented under the guise of reform, but what it really is essentially a process of institutional destruction. And for all practical purposes, the way that it basically is carried forward is by shutting down branches, shutting down institutions, firing people, and that means eliminating programs. The elimination of programs in a place like Argentina is something that belongs to a certain cycle of institutional rearrangement, which is warranted very often by economic downturns. So sometimes programs simply disappear because there is no more money to pay for them. In the US, many of these programs, and it's particularly the case with things like USAID, where its employees are not merely offering development opportunities to African or Latin American countries or Asian countries, but uh, um, they're actually the bearers of enormous informal power because they very often control the purse in areas where the government is absent, in matters like education or health, and they also very often fulfill the second function of doing surveillance and intelligence works in the area, and they are actually conduits. They have been often conduits for American intelligence. The destruction of these programs quite literally means the the retirement of American presence, or the elimination of the American footprint and geostrategic positioning uh, from these theaters. So now let's move to what happened Saturday, in which there was an express order against the Trump administration of outsourcing the detainment of illegal immigrants. We are told, we don't know that they were illegal immigrants, who had been rounded up in the US and now transferred to El Salvador. In the next sort of 72 hours since the judge issued this order and the Trump machine completely disregarded it, what we have witnessed, and this has been particularly vociferous in Elon Musk's Twitter account, which I think now can pretty much be treated as the I mean, echo chamber to some degree, but more importantly, the press virtual conference room of the Trump White House and administration. What we have seen in that account is a steady, systematic, and incredibly aggressive demand for arrest of politicians and the impeachment of judges, and all in all, the purge of the American judiciary system. So judges that are called, as many in Europe do, left or woke, in the mind of Musk and in the mind of clearly the Trump administration, are deserving of being purged out of the judicial system. And what this means is that what Trump and Musk are after is an American judicial system that is ideologically aligned with the White House. This is effectively the end of the American judiciary and the end, to a large degree, and I don't want to sound too dramatic, but I think it's worthwhile pointing out that this is the end of American democracy, to the extent that the judiciary must remain independent of the political wills and ideological interests of political powers. So the breakdown of a judiciary, which starts with Trump marching late last week into the Department of Justice and sort of giving a speech from a podium in the Department of Justice against the ideologically problematic figures within the justice system, should really give everybody pause, if not, just a bout of panic. So let's bring this to a bit of a conclusion. If you were to ask me, how we should think of Trump, I would say that Trump is not, as has been repeated many times, in the process of enforcing or deploying a coup, and that he's not in the process of, certainly not in the process of returning to a form of American conservatism that is more palatable to his base. What I rather see is that Trump, with the acquiescence, at least so far, of much of its base, um, a very large, I would say, a very large field of useful imbeciles. What Trump is doing is essentially fulfilling the wildest dreams of the Russian nostalgics and the Chinese interest. Um, as a matter of fact, let me quickly point out that China issued a statement of praise for Trump for the destruction of Voice of America, which they thought of being a very difficult opponent in distributing American positions on the Asian airwaves. So I think that Trump is really in the business of fulfilling precisely the wildest dreams of both Chinese and Russians, which really come down to this: the destruction of the US as we know it and the complete devastation of its political power. Now, it's almost impossible to say if Trump actually is a Russian asset, but at this point, that is probably completely irrelevant whether he actually is. The more important point is that not only Trump is fulfilling the wishes of his Russian friends and his Chinese friends in places like Ukraine, but he is much more importantly fulfilling the wishes of his Russian and Chinese friends in the US. The complete devastation of the US, its power structure, and its institutions signals something that I think we have never seen before, and that is very specifically not just a shift into multipolarity from American hegemony, but I think the end of the American political project.